We have come now to the part of the program where we will have our keynote speaker, a very unique keynote speaker, who is also the deputy chairperson for the committee, and she is the former personal assistant to the late Honorable H. Lavity Stoutt. I'm speaking about Mrs. Beverly Hodge Smith.
This will be fine. I acknowledge the protocol already established, and I say to you all a pleasant good morning. Today I am honored to be able to speak about a man whose life reflected his deep belief in the development of the human resources of this territory. This was pivotal to our overall development. I speak of no other than the late Honorable H. Lavity Stoutt, a visionary who throughout his political life dedicated his time to the betterment of his people. Mr. Stoutt was thrust into politics at the very early age of 28 years, when he was first elected to the Legislative Council in 1957. Following the introduction of a constitution in 1967, he was then elected as this territory's first chief minister and the first minister of education. I believe, and I dare say, that Mr. Stoutt long waited for that day when he could bring about the much-needed changes, not only in the economic development of this territory, but to a very flawed education system. He himself, from his own experience and from the experience of others, would have been aware of the many flaws in the education system and the disadvantage experienced by many throughout the territory because of these flaws. He knew that the territory could do better in that area, and he was adamant that he would break that cycle and give all children in this territory an opportunity to reach their potential. To illustrate a bit about the flawed education system, permit me to share with you my views on the system and some of my own experiences as well. During the early 60s, and certainly prior to Mr. Stout's appointment as this territory's first chief minister and minister of education, primary education was not at its best. In many communities, classes were held in the church buildings with cramped spaces and lack of educational materials. In some classes, there only existed up to fifth standard, as it was called then. In my village of Seacows Bay, classes were held at the old Methodist Church. Due to lack of space, classes were oftentimes held outdoors under a tree. At the time of my attendance, we had only up to third standard. This situation was similar for some districts on the outskirts of Roetown. For classes 4 and 5, students as young as 8 years old, I being one of them, had to travel to Roetown by foot to attend standards 4 and 5. In those days, the roads were not paved. Could you imagine your 8-year-old children trekking up hills? And the hills I talk about were what we call Manuel Hill, overlooking pieces of it. And then you trek down, and then you get to Slaney Hill, and then you trek down, and you walk through an area which was called the sandy ground. I remember it having lots of sand and lots of bushes. At 8 years old, that's what you had to go through. In class 5, you were allowed to sit the common entrance exam, as it was called, for entry into the secondary school. If you were successful, you then moved on to secondary school. if you were not successful and not too old, you were given an opportunity to resit the exam the following year. If that failed, you would then move into post-primary school to attain your 7th standard certificate. Secondary education during the same period was limited and considered privilege. The system only allowed for the accommodation of no more than 120 to 150 students. The success of students entering secondary school was dependent on space. So even if you were successful in the examination, you would have been denied a secondary education due to lack of space at the time. Your future in obtaining secondary education was therefore dependent on the decision taken by those appointed to do the selection process from persons whom they considered to be the top students. With this system, many bright students, so to speak, were denied secondary education. This scenario was tragic in many ways. It traumatized children deeply, and I don't think no evaluation was done on the trauma that it caused the children, but I can speak about that. It divided communities, and it caused emotional stress on families. Additionally, the year I and other colleagues set the common entrance exam, only a few of us from my community were successful, and I was among the few. Those who were not successful were devastated, and their family was equally devastated. Those who had access to relatives in St. Thomas, USVI, migrated there to get their secondary education. So no doubt this migration resulted in a drain on the population in several communities. Life at the Virgin Islands Secondary School during my period of attendance was good to a certain extent, but had very strict rules. In some instances, many students, especially those over 13, were not given ample opportunity to succeed and were removed from the school before being able to settling in. Additionally, students were not able to participate in all of the subjects offered. For example, if you were good in languages, you were selected to do Latin and Spanish subjects, and this was done as early as the second form. At the time, Latin was a dreaded class, and added to that, it was taught by the principal, the late P. Carlisle Scott. I, along with my dear friend Sonia Smith, can attest to the many hours we spent in that class and the rigidity of the teachings. While we were successful in obtaining distinction at the General Cambridge Examination, GCE O-Level, we still, to this day, miss the joy of participating in home economics, the cooking class. While there had been recommendations made about improvement to the education system at the primary and secondary levels long before Mr. Stout's appointment as this territory's first Chief Minister and Minister of Education, little or no action had been taken to turn these recommendations into reality. Certainly, families would have lamented about the situation in our education system to H. Lavity Stoutt on numerous occasions, and his response to those in his district certainly would have been, send me to the Legislative Council and I would fix it. To those outside of his district, he would have said, when I get to the Legislative Council, my people, I would fix that. True to his word, Mr. Stoutt left no stone unturned when he got to the Legislative Council. It was of utmost importance to him and a priority on his agenda. He immediately set the wheels turning and planned the building of a comprehensive school that would provide the space necessary to accommodate certainly more than 150 students. While proceeding to have the buildings constructed, he would face enormous challenges from those opposed to the expansion of the secondary school. But the more the challenges were hurled at him, the more H.L. Stoutt became an energizer bunny, and he pushed the construction of the buildings. Some even went as far as to say that he was building horse stables, and I have lived to see those hostables remain for a long, long time. In 1968, 3 buildings would have been completed, and the doors were thrown open to accommodate approximately 800 students from all walks of life. What a glorious day it was in this territory. Children who would not have otherwise been given the opportunity of a secondary education finally were able to benefit. Because of Mr. Stout's vision and determination to empower his people, change came to the secondary education system. Mr. Stoutt did not stop there. He would go on to ensure that his people would benefit from tertiary education once they had completed secondary education. He ensured that the BVI became a member of the University of the West Indies, and at the time, the requirement for entrance into that university was A-levels. He made it clear to the Chancellor of the University of the West Indies that BVI's educational system was not equipped to prepare the student for A-levels, but that we should be given the opportunity to enter the university with O-levels. As a matter of fact, he emphasized that BVI was a paying member, and not only that, we paid in US currency, so we were entitled to our fair share. The university then agreed to accept students with 7 O-levels. Mr. Stoutt went further, and he got the university to accept students with 5 O-levels and succeeded with that. He took a personal interest in students attending the University of the West Indies and would visit them anytime he was in Barbados on official duties. He also, on several instances, would arrange to meet with students still attending secondary school to encourage them to work hard to achieve the O-level passes needed to enter the University of the West Indies. And I can attest to that. I was one of those students he encouraged, but sadly I only had the 4 O-levels, so I didn't attend. He knew that quality education would empower his people and contribute to a strong foundation for the development of his beloved Virgin Islands. Mr. Stoutt continued his vision in this regard by ensuring that primary schools were expanded and new ones built throughout the territory. That improvement to the secondary school system continued, and that scholarships were awarded to as many students as possible from throughout the territory to pursue tertiary education in the neighboring US Virgin Islands and the United States. His continued commitment that would bolster his legacy in education was seen in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when he established and officially opened this territory's first community college, which would be later named in his honor. H. Lavity Stoutt was a strong driver of the empowerment of his people, whom he often referred to as my people. Through the development of education in this territory, his belief was that without a strong education system, we could not have a strong nation. He was solidly right, and from his vision, his determination, his commitment to empowering his people through education, this territory has successfully produced lawyers, doctors, nurses, teachers, educators, bankers, politicians, and all professions up to this day. This territory has been blessed to have a visionary like H. Lavity Stoutt as its leader. My hope is that the great work that he has done for this territory will be enshrined in the hearts of many generations. My further hope is that to make that a reality, the legacy of him, the legacy of other heroes and heroines of this territory, Mr. Minister of Education, Mr. Chief Minister, and all the leaders of this territory, the legacy of all these people should become a part of the history taught in our education system, and that must happen today. May the legacy of H. Lavity Stoutt live on, and may God continue to bless us and bless these Virgin Islands.